Welcome to Your Wise Self with Sarah, the podcast that invites you to embark on a journey of self-discovery, growth, and transformation. Thank you for joining me, Sarah, as I explore the profound wisdom that resides within each of us, waiting to be uncovered and embraced. Today, we are exploring grief and grief circles with health coach Larry Swanson. Larry Swanson holds an MD from the University of Minnesota and has worked as a medical researcher, writer, integrative provider, and integrative health and wellness coach. Her work experience combined with her personal healthcare journey has impassioned her to believe that health and wellness coaching is the missing link towards wellness in our system today. She has personally encountered the benefits of a holistic view of health, and she believes that integrative health and wellness coaching, combined with a focus on lifestyle medicine and behavior change expertise, can cultivate the physical and mental wellness we all crave. Welcome, Larry.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm so happy to be here with you.
Thank you so much for being here. Well, I am looking forward to exploring this complex journey of grief and the invaluable support that you have found in these grief circles that you're sharing with your clients. First, I wanted to share with our listeners about how we know each other. Larry and I went to school at the University of Minnesota in the Integrative Health and Wellness Coaching Program. So seeing you pave this path in your coaching world is so exciting, Larry. I'm so proud of you.
Thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate it.
It's great to have you here so that we can learn more about what you're doing with clients who are experiencing grief. You've really made this a prominent focus in your coaching. I'd like to have you share a little bit more about why this was important to you.
Grief has been a part of my life for many years, and I had a big grief experience in my 30s when my parents died. I have known since that time that I wanted to make the support and healing of grief a part of my life work. I've been doing it a long time non-professionally, and since I have been a part of our program and graduated, I have been doing it professionally as well.
In terms of having been the background with your personal experience combined with your medical training, you probably experienced seeing a lot of patients experiencing grief, and then your personal experience, and then going into the health and wellness coaching program, it is really something that it goes into mental health also. And I think that that's also an area that the health coaching field can help people with in some regards. Obviously, we're not licensed mental health providers, but people experiencing grief or changes can work with a health coach and help them come out on the other side feeling better. Can you tell us more about what grief is and why it's important to acknowledge and address it?
Absolutely, Sarah. Grief is universal. Grief will likely happen to each one of us at some point during our lives. And in fact, if we have the capacity to love, we will most likely experience grief. Loss and grief can happen many, many times during our lifetimes. It can be shocking and harsh and unrelenting. It can also be subtle and slow and complex. Either way, no matter how grief and loss come into our lives, the results are often profound. We now understand there are many, many different types of loss, in addition to the one we all think of, the death loss. But we run into so many of these kinds of loss in our coaching. Just to name a few, there's ambiguous loss, and that can present two different ways. Either when someone is absent emotionally and present physically, and that's the case of someone who has Alzheimer's disease. So a caregiver may be experiencing ambiguous loss on a daily basis as they care for their loved one. Ambiguous loss can also be the opposite, where somebody is absent physically but present emotionally. This happens in the case of prisoners of war or kidnapping victims. This is where somebody is physically missing but presumed alive, very present psychologically, emotionally in the minds of their loved ones. These kinds of loss are so challenging because there is no closure. There are other non-death losses that can be due to the loss of anything that's important to you, psychologically, physically, spiritually, or interpersonally. And these things can include retirement, the loss of a career, the loss of a limb or a body part due to surgery or a disease, the loss of friendship. We're finding that a lot, the loss of a family member as we navigate our challenging political system. There can be secondary losses, which are losses that follow a primary loss. Examples of this could be losing friends after a divorce or losing your financial stability after you lose a job or a career. Honestly, there are so many different kinds of loss. Another one that I experienced was anticipatory loss and grief. And that happens when we start to grieve a loss that has not yet happened. As we may discuss later, I was my mother's caregiver when she was diagnosed with ALS. She had that diagnosis for a year before she died. And I started experiencing loss and grief the day she received her diagnosis. And that shifted when she died to a different experience. Both of those losses and grief experiences were devastating. There are any numbers of types of loss and grief that people are experiencing on a daily basis. And very often they come to health coaching for one issue or thing they want to work through. And when we really get to the heart of what's going on, turns out that they're grappling with a loss and grief that has yet been unresolved.
It's really amazing that you can take this small word grief and take it into all these categories and phases that people can really experience, like what you explained about the anticipatory loss moving to a primary loss, for example. There's so many different ways for people to think about this, and maybe we haven't thought about it in this way before. Personally, I've also experienced loss, quite a bit of loss in my life. And I think that two things have been really prevalent for me. I have learned that there's really not a time limit on loss. And maybe you're finding that with your clients too, that maybe they experienced a loss 30 years ago and it's something they didn't quite work through or resolve at that time. And it's coming back around and showing up in other ways in their life. Have you had that experience with clients?
Absolutely, Sarah, 100%. When you say that there is no timeline to grief and there's no set right way to experience grief, and grieving can look different depending on where you are in your lifespan. So it's possible that someone had a significant loss early in their lives and have not yet had a chance to process that loss in a healthy and supportive way. That can come back up and bubble up and show up in different ways throughout their life. One thing we're learning is that unprocessed grief does not resolve. That's one thing that we're hoping to offer people in our loss and grief circles is a safe and supportive place where they can come together, look back on their personal histories, and begin to acknowledge and process some of the grief they have dealt with in their lives.
So one of the things that I noticed, you said something about grief not following a straight line. I remember probably in high school learning about the stages of grief. And it seemed to me at that point in time, and for maybe years after that, that was kind of a linear process that people went through: the denial, the anger, and then coming to acceptance at the end. What I think we've learned, though, is that that's not a linear process.
Absolutely. One grief expert I follow just literally put out an article this morning where she talked about how our society has really corrupted the stages of grief that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross initially introduced in her book. She talked about 5 stages of grief, but it was really never her intention for the study she was doing on dying people to be extrapolated to bereaved people. As North Americans, citizens of the US, we really like the linear checklists and processes, but grief is not like that. We actually don't move through particular stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. It just doesn't work that way. Grief can show up very violently and then it can subside for a while. And I like to think of it as a rushing river. It can occasionally be smooth and then there can be an unpredictable rapid just around any corner. It really comes and goes. Different things can trigger it. There's just no set set timeline, and every individual's experience of grief will be just that, individual to them.
Absolutely. And it seems like there's maybe some emotions along the way in concert with, so to speak, those different phases. So even if I'm in denial one day and I'm in acceptance the next day, and then I'm in bargaining the next day, and I'm kind of jumping around, emotions come up with each of those phases.
And it's not just emotions. I mean, obviously, emotions are huge when we talk about loss, and grief being the emotion that is our emotional response to loss. But there can be physical and mental and behavioral and spiritual manifestations of grief as well. For example, I'm sure most of us are familiar with brain fog that people get when they're going through grief. And that's a very real and normal part of the grief process. And we now are understanding that when people are grieving significantly, their brains are actually rearranging and the connections are rewiring. And there are huge growth changes that are taking place in the brains. So there are these mental manifestations as well. And then there are tons of physical manifestations to grief also. A loss of balance. People may find that they are more clumsy and they trip more when they're grieving, or that they have heart pain. And all of those things are true, valid experiences that actually manifest. The emotional manifestations are so real, but so are the physical and spiritual and mental.
Thank you for highlighting that. And I think that it's important, with my background in yoga therapy, is doing intentional breath work to help, because as you're talking about rewiring connections in our brain, breath work can help. And there's actually, I'll put this in our show notes too, but Max Strom, I oftentimes have shared this in my yoga training with various groups, but he has a 4-7-8 breath exercise that he walks people through. But he talks about how anxiety and this high level of stress can start. And when he would work with people, he would say, well, when did this start? And the person would say, when my parent died or my brother died, or whatever the scenario was, they were experiencing grief. And he would say, well, I don't think you have a stress problem, anxiety problem, you have a grief problem. And here's one tool of intentional breath work that can help with that.
Super interesting, Sarah. I agree with that. And breathing, remember, connects us to something much greater than ourselves. It connects us to all that is. Often when we have a huge loss or grief experience, we feel disconnected and alone and kind of free floating. So I agree. I think it's super important to bring breath into one's healing journey to become reconnected and to realize that we are still part of something greater and bigger than ourselves.
You also mentioned that you lost your parents. It sounds like that was a turning point in terms of your awareness of grief and also your guiding light.
I was drawn to this topic a long time ago due to my own grief and loss experiences. I'm an only child. I grew up being extremely close to both of my parents and pretty dependent on them. When I was young and just starting my own family, my mom was diagnosed with ALS, which is also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. It's really a devastating illness. As desperately as I loved my mom, I found there was almost nothing I could do to help her other than act as her caregiver and love her along the way. It was awful witnessing her decline, and it was absolutely terrifying to me to think of losing my rock, my support system, and my best friend. And she died less than a year after her diagnosis, and then my father, who was also heartbroken, died shortly after that. I was absolutely broken after this happened, and I looked everywhere for support. I tried grief counseling. I talked to the pastor at my church. I read every book I could get my hands on about grief. And after several years, I mean, this was a long, long process for me, I finally started coming back to life. And then I kind of started helping my friends deal with their own grief experiences. And what I learned was that sometimes the most helpful thing for someone who is grieving is simply a caring person who will listen to them and bear witness to their pain pain and their experience. I learned that grief is just a very human ordeal, and it's so normal. Instead of pathologizing it, I really wanted to normalize it. It became kind of a goal of mine to give hope to people in the depths of their grief that their pain would soften over time. If I could come back to life and find meaning again after my own grief, I just knew that others could as well. And I wanted to make it a mission of mine to help people do that.
And that's exactly what I was thinking was it sounds like this has become your life mission. And in yoga, we call it your dharma, which is your calling. Somebody who is willing to just listen, be a listening ear to a friend, and then take this and turn it into an opportunity also with health coaching. You have done a lot of training beyond just our health coaching program and specifically in grief work and grief circles. Tell us a little bit more about the grief circles.
Since graduating from our program, Sarah, I have taken probably 5 or 6 different courses on different types of grief. I've really learned a lot. I would say the overarching lesson or thing that has become apparent to me is just how normal this process is and really how human it is and pervasive. So I came into awareness of circle practice through a mentor of mine who is a fabulous health and wellness coach. And basically, a circle is a relational practice that has been used by Indigenous peoples throughout the world and throughout time to bring groups or communities together to explore important life events. And these can be anything from celebrations to conflicts or grief and loss. And research has really shown that people benefit from being part of a community when they are facing the same or similar life experiences. So a little bit more about circles. One of the circle experts from our region of the country, Kay Pranis, points out one ancient teaching that is foundational for circle work. This really, really resonated with me having graduated from our program. She says that the human experience, and I add certainly the experience of grief, has mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual aspects. All of these aspects are equally important and offer essential gifts to our collective lives. Balance among these aspects is important for the health of individuals and of communities. And circles intentionally create a space where all of these aspects of the human condition are recognized and welcomed. I learned about this practice, just seemed like a natural fit for those who were going through the pain of loss and grieving.
You're doing group work, which is going to provide the support you're talking about through groups and connection. Well, my other podcast episodes about connection and how important that is to our mental, physical, emotional health and everything that's related to that. So that really solidifies that people have that support. But what's different about a grief circle versus support or individual counseling and how that approach is helpful for people?
Circle is different from group work, for instance, in that the clinical or professional expertise is not the primary resource. As described by Kay Pranis, it's the storytelling by the participants based on their own life experiences and self-reflection that become the main sources for insight. And unlike in therapy, the keeper of the circle or the mentor, the circle leader, often participates in the process and they may share their own relevant life experiences. So the circle keeper ends up doing their own work right alongside the participants. And I think this adds to the feeling of camaraderie, of connection, that feeling that we are all in this together. No one is the teacher versus the student. It's just circle is such a great equalizer. Everyone shows up as they are, where they are in their own life experience, and they all do their own work.
Health coaching means that we are not the expert. Actually, the people we're working with are the experts in their own lives. We're just there to help guide them. You made a really helpful point too, that in these circles that you're part of that. So as you're still continuing to heal, even from years and years ago, is it helping you also continue to work through that?
100%, Sarah. Part of this circle is educational. We do a couple educational weeks, and then we dive into telling our own loss and grief stories. It's been really interesting contemplating my own story. We usually ask the group to reflect on the first experience of loss and grief that they can remember in their lives. And often this goes back, way back to early childhood. It's been really interesting to see how our first experiences with loss often shape and inform how we experience loss and grief later in life. And our understanding of loss evolves over time. For example, in my own story, although I tell an iteration of the same story in each circle, the more that I go back and examine that story within the context of the rest of my life and what's going on for me today, the deeper and more meaningful and more interesting that story becomes, and the deeper my healing becomes. So the experience alone of exploring my history with loss and grief has been incredibly illuminating and growth promoting for me. I've gotten so much out of each circle that we've done.
Illuminates for everybody listening that it's not like we go through the grief process once. I think we've said that in different ways throughout our conversation, is that it's something that we're experiencing over and over, and we're hearing a little bit different story each time, or a little different part is coming in. It's able to just continue to heal that. And we all know that time does heal to some degree, but we also talked about the fact that oftentimes grief is going to be there for a long time. We just are going to continue to have the opportunity to work through that. And this is one of those opportunities, is that people could work with you in circles. When considering joining a grief circle, what would people look for?
I would say joining a grief circle is a deeply personal and vulnerable experience for most. Finding the right facilitator and the right group is crucial. I would recommend that people look for facilitators who have extensive training in circle work, as well as experience working with loss and grief. And hopefully they have their own experience they're willing to share. A well-run grief circle will have really clear guidelines to ensure the emotional safety of all the participants in the circle. While grief circles can be immensely helpful, and I believe have been for the people who have participated in ours, they're definitely not a substitute for professional therapy or counseling, especially in cases of complicated grief or trauma. So a good facilitator should be able to recognize trauma, be trauma informed, and provide referrals to appropriate resources if needed.
It sounds like in some cases this would be a good addition to therapy or counseling.
Absolutely.
So you provide these online or in person typically?
We have been providing these via Zoom, and we have participants not only from around the country, but from around the world. That has been really special too, to see how other people from other cultures are experiencing their own traumas, their own loss and grief, and how similar we really are as human beings, no matter what culture, race, ethnicity we come from.
So people could actually connect directly with you no matter where they're at. And so I'm just curious, do you mind sharing how people might get in touch with you directly?
I would love to, Sarah. I have a website, which is achievehealthandwellnesscoaching.com. I advertise upcoming circles on that website. My mentor and I are always offering circles. Now we are expanding into different specific types of circles. I'm really excited to share that we are going to start a loss and grief circle for young people who have lost a parent or other significant loved one before they turn 20. My co-facilitator for that circle is a young woman who lost her father as a teenager, and I am really excited to be stepping into that arena as well.
That is just amazing because, again, I can connect so much with the work that you're doing. And especially because, as I mentioned earlier, have also experienced so much loss in my life. One of mine was actually my father passed away just shy of my 20th birthday. So when I hear this, it's so wonderful to know that you're this resource out in the world and helping guide people through this process and give them tools and resources to help them navigate all of these heavy heavy feelings that can come along with grief and loss. That also leads me to just finding out more resources. If people are wanting to learn more about the topic of grief or circle work, where would they find that?
So there are a lot of resources out there. People want to learn more about circle work. I really recommend one book by Kay Pranis, and it's called The Little Book of Circle Processes. And then I have a lot of wonderful grief and loss resources listed on the journal page of my website. So tons of books. There's some podcasts.
Wonderful. And your website is packed full of great information. And I will make sure that those links are in our show notes from today.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. Honestly, it has been such a pleasure being here with you and having the opportunity to speak about grief a little bit. I hope, if nothing else, I have been able to normalize the grief process for people, to offer some hope that acknowledgement first about how terrible grief and loss can be, how life-changing they can be, but then to offer some hope that over time, the process and the pain soften. And honestly, for many, many years, I did not think I would get over, and not even get over. I didn't know that I would come out of the darkness of loss and grief. I have, and if I can do it, others can do it too. Maybe all they need is support, witnessing of what they're going through.
As we went through school and we saw our cohort working through this program and each of us having an area of emphasis that was important to us and a place where our heart was really feeling a pull towards to help people and support people. And I know that this is going to touch so many and give people more resilience and more resources to be able to navigate the difficulties of grief. So thank you so much for being here today and sharing with us your good work.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. It's been an honor.
Thank you for tuning in to Your Wise Self with Sarah. I hope you enjoyed today's episode as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. Please subscribe, rate, and review on your favorite podcast platform. Join us next time for more ways that you will access wisdom that resides within yourself. Until then, stay curious, stay inspired, and keep exploring.